Okay, so you brought us this book, The Innovator's Dilemma, and it really gets at something I think we've all wondered about. You see these big successful companies, right? The ones that are at the top of their game, at least for a while. But then sometimes they totally miss the boat when their whole industry goes through a massive shift.
Yeah, it's a head scratcher, isn't it?
It is.
You'd think, with all their resources, all the smart people they have on board, they'd be the first ones to adapt. But actually, Christensen argues that it's often that very success that makes them vulnerable.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, they get caught in what he calls the value network trap.
Okay, so unpack that for us a bit. What is this value network trap?
Sure, so imagine a company like, say, Sears, back in the day. They were the retail giants, everyone knew them, known for listening to their customers, delivering what people wanted. But then they completely missed the rise of these discount retailers like Kmart. Kmart comes in, different customer base, different value proposition, and Sears is caught flat-footed.
So they were so focused on what had made them successful, they didn't even see this other thing happening, this shift over there in a different part of the market.
Exactly. And Christensen uses the example of the disk drive industry as like a prime example. Now, I know disk drives might not sound like the most thrilling thing,
Sure, sure.
but this industry is like a fast-forward button on how businesses evolve or don't.
Because technology changes so fast in that world.
Precisely. So you had these massive 14-inch drives that were used in mainframes, and they shrink down to 8-inch for mini computers, and then boom, the 5.25-inch drives come in to power the PC revolution. Each time, it's a new set of players that come in and dominate.
And the old guard, the companies that were there before,
Yep.
they just stick with the old ways.
They do. And it wasn't that they were clueless. They were actually great at making these incremental improvements, what Christensen calls sustaining technologies. But what they miss consistently are the disruptive technologies, things like those smaller disk drives. Initially, those serve a different market, maybe a less demanding customer, but that's where it starts.
So it's not that they weren't innovating, they were just innovating in the wrong direction, too focused on making what they already had better for the same customers.
Exactly. And this is where those value networks come into play. These companies get locked into a system. Their customers, their suppliers, their whole cost structure.
Yeah.
It's all geared toward one market with one set of expectations.
It's like they're stuck in their lane, optimizing for a race that's about to change course entirely.
That's a great way to put it. And those smaller disruptive technologies, they're often emerging in a completely different lane, different rules, different trajectory.
So the established players, they look over at this other lane, this other way of doing things, and they think, well, that's not where the money is, or our customers aren't asking for that. But they don't realize the whole game's about to change.
Exactly. They're so busy playing the current game well, they're blind to the new game that's emerging. It's like those old massive steel mills
Oh, right.
that got totally caught off guard by the rise of minimills.
The minimills being smaller, more nimble, able to target a different segment of the market.
Exactly. Christensen uses Nucor as a great example. They start small, focus on a niche, and then gradually they disrupt the entire steel industry. And here's the kicker. Even when these established companies see the threat, even when they can't deny it anymore, they often respond in ways that just make things worse for themselves.
Oh, that's interesting. So even with hindsight, with the chance to look back and say, wow, we really messed that up, they're still making the wrong moves. How so?
Well, it often starts with listening to their best customers, which sounds logical.
Right, right.
But those customers are usually happy with the existing technology. So the company pours resources into making those products even better, further blinding themselves to the real change that's happening elsewhere.
It's like they're trying to outrun a tidal wave by running towards it. So what happens next in this slow motion train wreck?
They dismiss the new players, right? These upstarts. They're too small. They don't have the resources. It's just a fad.
They're not a real threat. Famous last word.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But by the time they realize the danger, it's too late. They've been outmaneuvered, out-innovated, often outpriced. Classic disruption. And it highlights something really important. It's not just about the technology, right? It's about the processes and values that shape how these companies respond to change in the first place.
Processes and values. Okay, let's unpack those, because those sound like critical pieces of the puzzle. We'll delve into that in part 2 of our deep dive into the innovator's dilemma. So we're talking about processes and values, these sort of hidden factors that can really make or break a company, especially when they're facing disruption. Can you walk us through that? Like, what do those actually look like in action?
Sure. So think about a company's processes, kind of like it's a well-oiled machine. It's how decisions get made, how they allocate resources, how products get developed and launched, all of that.
Right.
And these processes, they're often really well optimized, but it's for a specific thing for the existing market, for their current business model, the way things are right now.
So they're good at churning out those incremental improvements, making what they already have a bit better, a bit cheaper, a bit faster, that kind of thing.
Exactly. But here's the thing. What happens when the whole game changes? When the market shifts to a radically different technology or a whole new business model comes along?
Those finely tuned processes, all that optimization, it almost becomes a liability, doesn't it?
That's right. It's like trying to win a Formula One race with a bus. The bus might be great for what it does, but...
Wrong tool for the job.
Exactly.
So how do companies get stuck in that bus, so to speak?
Well, that's where values come in. These are those deeply held beliefs about what's important, what actually defines success for that company. You know, the company might say they value innovation. It's like everyone puts that on the wall these days.
Sure, it's a buzzword.
Right. But do their actions actually back that up?
So if their real value, the thing they're actually measured on, is maintaining high profit margins, they might miss an opportunity in a market that, at least initially, has lower margins, even if that market's poised to explode, even if it's the future.
Precisely. It's like their values are these blinders that prevent them from seeing the true potential of these disruptive innovations. Christensen has another really good example of this with Hewlett-Packard, actually.
HP, the Pringer company.
Yeah, so inside HP, there was this battle going on, a real internal struggle between their laser printer division, which was a huge cash cow for them.
Right. Everyone had a laser printer.
And this emerging inkjet technology. Now, inkjet, at first it was slower, quality wasn't quite there, but it had the potential to be way cheaper.
And I'm guessing HP's processes, their whole mindset was set up for the laser printer, their cash cow.
You got it. And it took a real internal fight, almost a mini disruption within the company, for inkjet to get the resources and attention it needed. It makes you wonder, what if they'd ignored those signals? What if they hadn't adapted?
They could have become the next Kodak. You know, clinging to an old technology while a whole new era of printing just unfolds without them. It's kind of scary when you think about it. So is this all inevitable? Are companies doomed to fall into this innovator's dilemma? Is there no hope?
Not at all. Christensen actually offers some hope. He talks about strategies, things companies can do to not just survive, but to thrive in the face of all this disruptive change. One of the most effective is the idea of spin-outs.
Spin-outs. So that's like setting up these separate divisions or even independent companies, but it's to pursue those newer opportunities, right?
Exactly. He uses the example of Quantum, remember them, disk drive maker.
Yeah.
They spun out this whole separate unit just to focus on those smaller, cheaper drives, gave them some breathing room, free them from all the constraints of the parent company's processes and values.
So it's like giving the speedboat its own racetrack, right? Letting it operate with a different set of rules and a totally different pace.
Precisely. And they didn't have to deal with all the legacy systems, all that risk-averse culture that you get in a big, established business.
Makes sense.
Another strategy Christensen talks about is the power of acquisitions.
Acquisitions. Isn't that kind of like admitting defeat, though? Just buying up the competition?
It might seem that way, but it can be really smart if it's done right.
Yeah.
He gives the example of Allen Bradley. They dominated the market for those electromechanical motor controls.
Okay, I'm picturing those big, clunky control panels you used to see in old factories.
Yeah.
Exactly. Big, expensive, the whole 9 yards. But they saw the writing on the wall. This new thing, electronic controls, they were coming on strong.
Which initially were probably less powerful, but way more flexible, way cheaper to produce, right?
You got it. So instead of trying to force their existing processes and values onto this new tech, they did something smart. They went out and acquired a couple of smaller companies that were already making waves in that space.
They brought in that expertise, that agility, and maybe even more importantly, that fresh perspective from those smaller players. Almost like they injected a dose of disruptive DNA into their own organization.
That's a great way to put it. And then finally, Christensen talks about this idea of discovery-driven planning.
Discovery-driven planning. Okay, I like the sound of that. What's that all about?
Well, it starts with recognizing that in the face of real disruption, you don't have all the answers up front. You can't just rely on your existing market research or 5-year plans, all of that.
Because it's all based on the old rules, the old assumptions about how the market works. Exactly. Discovery-driven planning is about being open to learning, to experimenting, to adapting as you go. It's like setting off on an expedition, right?
Yeah.
You need a general direction, but you also got to be prepared to adjust course. You're going to encounter New information, new challenges, you have to roll with it.
So it's about embracing uncertainty, being open to new information, and being willing to pivot when you need to.
Exactly. And that requires a different kind of mindset, one that's less about avoiding failure at all costs
Yeah.
and more about embracing it as a learning opportunity.
Which is tough. That's a big shift for a lot of companies, especially these large established players. It takes a certain amount of humility, don't you
It
think?
does.
To admit that you don't have all the answers. So how do they actually do that? What are some of the concrete ways companies can put this discovery-driven planning into practice? How do you go from theory to reality? So how do they actually do that? What are some of the concrete ways companies can put this discovery-driven planning into practice? How do you go from theory to reality?
It starts with the culture, I think. You have to foster this culture of inquiry, where people at all levels, they feel comfortable questioning the status quo, challenging assumptions, bringing new ideas to the table, even if they seem a little bit out there at first.
So it's about creating that space where people aren't afraid to say, hey, what if we tried it this way? Or have we considered this new approach? But it can't just be talk, right?
Right, exactly. It's not enough to just talk about innovation. You have to back it up.
So how do you go from encouraging those what ifs to actually testing them out in the real world?
Experimentation is key. Instead of waiting for the perfect plan, that guaranteed success, companies need to be willing to run some experiments. Small ones, low risk, just to test the waters, gather some real-world feedback.
Gives that whole fail fast, learn faster mentality.
Exactly. And these experiments, they don't have to be these huge budget-busting initiatives. Could be as simple as testing out a new feature but with a small group of customers. Or trying a new marketing approach, but in a limited market, just to see what happens.
Yeah, dip your toes in the water instead of cannonballing in without knowing what's below the surface.
Precisely. And then, as you gather that data, you have to be willing to adapt, pivot, maybe even kill off those ideas that aren't working.
Be flexible, be agile, respond to that feedback you're getting rather than just stubbornly sticking to a plan that's clearly not working.
Yeah, and sometimes it even means being willing to, and this is going to sound weird, but cannibalize your own success.
Cannibalize your own success. Okay, now you're really throwing me for a loop. What does that even mean in a business context?
It means being willing to disrupt your own stuff, your own products, your services, even if they're profitable, before somebody else does it for you. Think about it. If you're not willing to disrupt yourself, someone else will be more than happy to do it for you.
So you got to have the foresight and, let's be honest, the guts to say, this thing we're doing, yeah, it's working, but we can't rest on our laurels here. We've got to be looking for that next big thing, even if it means shaking things up a bit.
Exactly. And that takes leadership, right? Strong leadership. Leaders who are willing to challenge the status quo, to embrace change, and to empower their teams to do the same.
So it's about more than just a single decision. It's about the whole culture. Innovation can't be just a buzzword. It has to be woven into how the company operates at every level.
Yes. And I think that's one of the most important takeaways from the innovator's dilemma. It's a call to action for companies of all sizes, but especially those big established players, the ones who might be a little too comfortable with their success.
Because as we've seen, that comfort can be deceiving. What seems like a sure thing today could be gone tomorrow. So, as you go about your day, as you're thinking about your own work, your own industry, think about those potential disruptors lurking out there. What are those seemingly small innovations, those little shifts that could have the power to upend the status quo in your world?
What are those blind spots that might be preventing you or your company from seeing that next big wave? And most importantly, what can you do starting today to really embrace this challenge of disruption? How can you turn it into an opportunity for growth?
Because, as Christensen shows us, the future really does belong to those who are willing to shape it. Thanks for diving into the innovator's dilemma with us.
Yeah.